What up YouTube, it's Luca. Just before this video begins, I feel the need to mention that while I was making this video, the National Dex tier underwent a lot of changes. Terrestrialization was banned, which also caused some of these Pokemon that I talk about in the video to get unbanned. And by some I mean like 2/3 of them. So yeah, most of the Pokemon that I talk about in this video are right now currently legal again in both tiers, National Dex and Overused. But nevertheless, I still thought this was an interesting topic to cover, since, I mean, after all, they have been banned in National Dex before, whereas they have never been banned in Overused by comparison. And on top of that, this video has taken so long to come out that I don't really want to just throw it out entirely. That would make me very sad. So yeah, just thought I'd mention that before the video started. But that's all from me. Enjoy. In competitive Pokemon, some Pokemon are evidently stronger than others. However, sometimes a Pokemon can be so powerful that its presence negatively affects the tier, leading to a ban on that Pokemon. A Pokemon being banned can happen due to a variety of reasons. Because they abuse a certain gimmick too well, because they match up well against many other popular Pokemon in the tier, or because they are just too powerful in and of themselves based on stats, moves or abilities. Bans happen in almost every tier of competitive Pokemon, even tiers that are mostly casual and for fun, because banning one overbearing Pokemon might benefit a whole host of other Pokemon that likely wouldn't be able to keep up otherwise. As such, the goal of banning certain Pokemon is to keep the number of viable Pokemon as high as possible by removing the bad actors causing centralization, and thus prevent teams from becoming stale and including the same 3 to 4 Pokemon that are clearly stronger than everything else around them. However, because a Pokemon's viability is heavily tied to the metagame, and thus which other Pokemon are used most often, the list of banned Pokemon can vary wildly between different tiers. Even though some tiers may initially seem very similar, based on their rules and what kind of Pokemon are allowed, small differences can still lead to far-reaching consequences for a Pokemon's viability between different tiers. To demonstrate this, let's compare two tiers that have a lot in common. First, the standard Scarlet and Violet Overused tier, and second, the National Dex OverUsed tier that I always play on. I've covered this in a previous video, but the National Dex tier basically acts as a conglomerate of all the modern generations, introducing newer Pokemon from generations 8 and 9 into an environment similar to that of generation 7, which includes Mega-Pokémon, Z-moves, and all the Pokemon that aren't in the Galarian nor the Paldean Pokédex. For example, in this one team I use, Dragapult is fighting alongside Mega Scizor and the Z conversion Porygon Z. While this might seem like it would lead to a vastly different metagame, the changes aren't as big as you might expect. The current National Dex tier can best be described as a combination of current Scarlet and Violet Overused and Generation 7 Overused. Prominent Mega Pokémon from back in Generation 7, like Mega Scizor, Mega Swampert and Mega Lopunny, are still widely used in National Dex today, and new threats from Generation 9, like Iron Valiant, Great Tusk and Raging Bolt, are often just about as strong in National Dex as in Standard OU. So on the surface, both the available and the best Pokemon seem pretty similar between the two tiers, with National Dex just including a few extra Pokemon by way of Mega Evolution and Pokemon that don't exist in Generation 9 yet, such as Tapu Koko and Lele. However, because Mega Evolution brings old threats such as Swampert and Lopunny back into the spotlight, and Z-moves bolster the power of already strong Pokemon such as Landorus and Kartana, The power level in the National Dex tier is generally higher when compared to the standard Generation 9 Overused tier. The presence of many more powerful Pokémon and more Pokémon in general means it is much easier for any one Pokémon to be overlooked due to the presence of so many other options. It doesn't even matter that all of these Pokémon aren't necessarily on the same level. The larger the list of available options, the larger the chance that a strong Pokémon is just forgotten or glossed over in favor of something else. For this reason, there are some Pokémon who are still allowed in the National Dex tier, despite having gotten banned in standard Generation 9 Overused, because the higher general power level keeps them more balanced in this tier. This is the case with Gliscor, for example, who was banned from Generation 9 Overused soon after its reintroduction in the first DLC. Though it has since also been unbanned following the release of the second DLC, the presence of Mega-Pokémon and Z-moves means that its defensive capabilities were never as outstanding in National Dex when compared to Overused. Also, hidden power still existing in National Dex means that a lot more Pokémon can significantly damage Gliscor in this format. Make no mistake, Gliscor is still definitely an elite Pokémon in the tier, but not to the point of being detrimental to the wider metagame. Such instances don't just happen to defensive Pokémon like Gliscor either. Archaludon, Urshifu Rapid Strike and Volcarona are all Pokémon that are currently or were at some point banned from Overused, but are still allowed in National Dex due to the presence of more options for taking their boosted hits or hitting back harder and faster. So by this point, I've hopefully been able to show that while the increased power being flexed in National Dex may be detrimental to the viability of more niche Pokémon, there are also those that benefit from the tougher surroundings, as it makes them not as ban-worthy as they would be in Overused. However, what about when the opposite happens? Up to this point of the video, I've been talking about how some of the Pokémon considered broken in Overused are fine in National Dex, because the Pokémon in National Dex are, on average, stronger than in standard Overused. But, believe it or not, there are actually 6 Pokémon that are currently banned from National Dex, despite still being allowed in Overused. So, let's finally discuss the main premise of this video and take a look at each of these Pokémon to figure out what they have in common that could cause this strange occurrence. Kingambit and Dragapult are both Pokémon where the reason as to why they are banned in National Dex but not Overused is actually pretty simple. They're just built difference between both tiers, as both Pokémon have vastly expanded toolkits in National Dex, courtesy of the way that tier handles Pokémon introduced post Generation 7. These Pokémon have never gotten to enjoy certain moves that they would have had access to, but got removed between Generation 7 and 8, or 8 and 9. Additionally, their introduction after Generation 7 meant that they never got to enjoy the benefits of Z-moves. Luckily, National Dex exists to actualize these hypotheticals, and these two Pokémon were perhaps impacted most positively by this. We'll cover Dragapult first, since its reason for getting banned was pretty obvious. Ghostium Z. Given that Dragapult had neither a special boosting move nor a splashable physical ghost attack, most offensive Dragapult sets were forced into becoming either a special attacker with no way of increasing its damage output outside of choice packs, or a physical Dragon Dance sweeper that couldn't really attack from its other type without giving the opponent an entire turn to prepare for it. Not really an ideal outcome either way. Well, with Ghostium Z that issue was alleviated enough to make Dragon Dance Dragapult a legitimate menace in National Dex. Even though Ghostium Z only gave it one super powerful instant burst of ghost type damage, This was often enough to surgically remove key threats for both its own sweep and those of its teammates. With a simple set of substitutes, Dragon Dance, Dragon Darts and, of course, Phantom Force plus Ghost DMZ, Dragapult caused casualties among National Dex players everywhere, with the speed boost from Dragon Dance making its already absurd speed stat even higher, to the point of outspeeding most choice scarfers, and its substitute protecting it from status afflictions and stray priority. And of course, with Ghost DMZ it could always just blow something up on the spot, with even super defensive Pokemon like Toxapex getting at least 3/4 of their health taken away after just one Dragon Dance. As such, Dragapult was first banned in Generation 8 National Dex, and despite being allowed back in at the start of Generation 9, it was eventually banned again. Kingambit faced a similar yet different journey. National Dex also features every move that was deleted from regular play in Generations 8 and 9, such as Return, Frustration, the aforementioned Hidden Power, and most importantly for us, Pursuit. Since Bisharp has access to Pursuit in Generation 7 and Generation 8 National Dex, the move was also given to Kingambit when it was introduced in Generation 9 as an evolution of Bisharp. And as if Kingambit with Pursuit doesn't sound bad enough, it also got Knockoff, which its evolutionary line lost access to in the transition to Generation 9. Luckily, National Dex lets any Pokemon use any move that they have historically had access to. These significant additions to its move pool meant that in addition to its threatening Swords Dance set, which makes up like 99% of the Kingambit in regular Overused, it could also viably run an Assault Vest set in National Dex, making use of the utility of Pursuit and Knockoff whilst acting as an excellent check to threatening special attackers such as Tapu Lele. Thus, the Pokemon already famous for its unpredictability, as it could viably run nearly every Terra type defensively, became even more versatile, as it could now make a name for itself as both a Swords Dance sweeper and an excellent mid-game attacker and tank. Because of this, Kingambit was banned despite still being allowed to run wild in regular Overused, probably because there you at least always know what a Kingambit is going to do. Wait, what? Also, fun fact, despite Kingambit having access to Z moves in National Dex, I didn't find any records of it using those much, which, now that I think about it, does kind of make sense. After all, between Kowtow Cleave, Sucker Punch, Pursuit and Knockoff, it already has plenty of options for dealing strong dark type damage, and Steel isn't really the greatest offensive type, so yeah. I still think that Kingambit wasn't that much of a problem in the tier, and that a skillful player could probably beat it pretty consistently. Then again, if my recent National Dex streams have shown anything, it's that I'm probably not one of the skilled players that get to make such calls. Okay, alright, if I lose this, I'm ending the stream. Gholdengo and Deoxys speed left a different kind of mark on the National Dex tier. Not through sheer attacking prowess like Kingambit and Dragapult, but through a bit more of a roundabout way. Whereas Kingambit and Dragapult were pretty broken of their own accord, they at least confined the problems to themselves. Not these two. Gholdengo and Deoxys speed both bolstered the viability of hazard stacking and hyper offense teams respectively. They teamed up on occasion as well. Deoxys speed set them up and Gholdengo knocked them down, maintaining the hazards that Deoxys set up and being able to freely attack while doing so, with or without Z moves. This is more of a problem in National Dex where, as mentioned before, the power level of the Pokemon on these teams is higher, creating more volatile and unstable matches. You know, in regular Overused you have to deal with Magic Bounce Hatterene, and in National Dex you have to deal with Magic Bounce Mega-Pokémon. Stuff like that. Quite a difference. Gholdengo especially caused problems as it shifted the very metagame of National Dex by itself. Due to its typing making it immune to rapid spin and trapping, and its ability making it immune to defog and status afflictions, Gholdengo was actually the biggest obstacle to the very same hazard stacking teams that it fit on best. This pushed the metagame in a direction more focused on offensive teams, which created more volatility and centralization within the tier, putting massive restrictions on team building and making the tier overall less fun to play. As for Deoxys speed, with it being released in Generation 9 National Dex after being banned in Generation 8, it quickly became the best lead for hyper-offense teams, with its access to Stealth Rocks, Spikes, Taunt, Psycho Boost and the highest speed of all relevant Pokémon. With these tools, it could either get up multiple layers of hazards, deny the opponent's hazards, chunk the opposing lead for massive damage, or all three depending on how you and your opponent played the early game. Now, Deoxys might have gotten screwed over a little bit, given that it was released into the tier at the very beginning and thus had Pokémon on its team such as Fluttermane and Genesect, who were clearly going to be banned sooner or later, which might have exacerbated how much of a problem Deoxys really was, but let's not talk about that. All in all, because the teams that Gholdengo and Deoxys Speed found themselves on were becoming too strong, and Gholdengo and Deoxys were both identified as linchpins of their respective teams, with tools that no other Pokémon could effectively replicate to the same degree, action was taken to remove both of them from the tier, with Gholdengo being subjected to a suspect test and Deoxys Speed just being banned outright alongside many other broken Pokémon in the first week of the tier's existence. Our last pair of Pokémon banned from National Dex but not from Overused were also mainly seen on a specific type of team. Walking Wake and Roaring Moon are kind of a combination of the first and second duo, because their potential for relentless offensive power made certain teams too broken. In this case, weather teams. Walking Wake is basically one of the best Pokémon for use on sun teams, because it is the first water type that actually benefits from the harsh sunlight, and it can thus act as a great force against the ground and rock types that threaten fire type Pokémon, as well as opposing fire type Pokémon like Skeledirge that could take boosted fire moves. But that's not all. Being an offensive water type, Walking Wake is also a great Pokémon on rain teams. And with National Dex exclusive teammates such as Mega Charizard Y to set up the sun, Volcarona who isn't banned, and Mega Swampert to deal with specially defensive Pokémon and set up Stealth Rocks, you can bet that weather teams use this Pokémon. A lot. In fact, Walking Wake was probably one of the most important Pokémon on weather teams against other weather teams. Its quadruple resistance to both fire and water made it a great teammate to soak up weather boosted hits from the opponent and then hit back hard against them. In addition, because its signature move Hydro Steam received a power boost in both sun and rain, Walking Wake didn't really care as much for which weather effects were active at any point in the game. However, because Walking Wake was such an important Pokémon on all of rain and sun teams, as both an offensive powerhouse and a defensive stopgap against opposing weather, weather wars had a tendency to get messy. Basically, whoever took down the opposing Walking Wake first gained a huge advantage, as this removed both a key damage dealer and hit taker from the opposition. Add on to this the fact that the best switch in to a choice locked Walking Wake was often your own Walking Wake, and it wasn't unlikely for weather teams to just sacrifice Pokémon back and forth to force out Walking Wake until someone won. Obviously, this was a problem, in addition to Walking Wake being really strong when facing a non-weather team, as it would pair well with other weather abusers like Gouging Fire, Archaludon, and the aforementioned Mega Swampert and Volcarona. A Pokémon warranting this level of foresight, caution, and sometimes luck to beat was obviously seen as a problem, and was subsequently quick banned from National Dex. And lastly, we have Roaring Moon. And oh man, what a sad life Roaring Moon has had in National Dex. You know how I said earlier that Deoxys might have been screwed over because some of its teammates, whom it got banned alongside, were the real problem? Well, compared to Roaring Moon, Deoxys God of Light. It was also banned in the first week of National Dex. Yes, this Pokémon, which has been a staple of regular overused since day one, was banned alongside monsters such as Fluttermane, Palafin, and Deoxys Speed, funnily enough. But why? Was it such a great abuser of Z-moves or something else native to National Dex? No, actually. It was just due to a small mistake by the player base. You see, back during the first week of Generation 9, when the exact inner workings of the game's mechanics were still being figured out, people wrongly assumed that the ability of all the Paradox Pokémon, Photosynthesis, always boosted the Pokémon's highest stat by 50%. This made Roaring Moon pretty busted, as it could basically get a free 50% boost to its attack, and on some teams it could also get this boost without using booster energy, meaning you had to deal with a Roaring Moon with an instant 50% boost to its attack, and its item slot still open for something like Choice Band or Life Orb. Its damage output was too high, especially since terrestrialization was another option on top of everything else, so it was quickly banned alongside these other Pokémon in an attempt to shape some stability in the tier. However, it was quickly discovered that Roaring Moon's ban might have been unconstitutional, as further digging into Scarlet and Violet's mechanics brought to light that only Speed received a 50% boost upon the activation of Photosynthesis. Any other stat that was boosted would only get a 30% boost. This meant that Roaring Moon could feasibly return to the tier, right? Well, not quite yet. People did want it unbanned at first, until it received knockoff in the first DLC of Scarlet and Violet, and people once again became a bit more pessimistic about its chances of being suitable for National Dex. By the time it finally received a suspect test to potentially return to the tier, the second DLC had already come out, notably adding Raging Bolt and Gouging Fire. Pretty strong competition, but hey, that would only make Roaring Moon less overpowered in the tier, right? Except no, because people actually argued that the presence of these two prevented Roaring Moon from being allowed back into the tier, as the three of them together would make Sun teams far too strong offensively. So we're kind of looking at a Walking Wake situation again, this time just spread over 3 Pokémon instead of just 1. Having 3 of these powerful Pokémon that abuse the sun on one team would be unmanageable for any opposing team, so if one had to go, why not the one that's already banned to not shake up the status quo? Thus, Roaring Moon remained banned because it would be too strong alongside these other strong Paradox Pokémon that just happened to get here first. That's right, after homophobic Ferrothorn, on this episode of Competitive Pokémon, Roaring Moon became the victim of discrimination and was never given a fair chance to establish itself in the tier. So, from these examples, we can deduce some overlapping trends between these 6 different Pokémon regarding why they are banned. There seem to be 2 primary influences at play here. Firstly, Gholdengo, Deoxys Speed, Walking Wake and Roaring Moon all make certain teams much more powerful, changing the most dominant team archetypes in the tier, how people build these teams, and how people using other teams prepare for battles against such teams. These 4 individual Pokémon were thus banned because they had a strong influence on the tier. And then there's the opposing side of Kingambit and Dragapult, whose use of moves or gimmicks unique to National Dex caused them not to suffer from the competition of Mega-Pokémon or other Z-move abusers. So in this case, it was the tier influencing the Pokémon that caused these bans, by granting them access to options they wouldn't have access to in other tiers such as standard overused. Thus, what we can see is that while one or multiple Pokémon can significantly affect the tier can also have an effect on the individual Pokémon through its underlying rules. And on top of this, the metagame is also another aspect of the tier that is a big factor in deciding the most dominant Pokémon. I mentioned earlier how Pokémon like Gholdengo and Walking Wake had a large influence on the metagame and thus the tier by significantly changing what the most used team styles were. But there is perhaps no greater example of such a phenomenon than with our final Pokémon. That's right, I left one such anomalous Pokémon off the list up to now, because it's relevant for this conclusion. Because on the surface, there doesn't really seem to be a concrete reason as to why Zamazenta is banned in National Dex, but not in Overused. It's not a particularly standout abuser of Z-moves, it kind of just does the same thing in both tiers. However, it's the Pokémon around it that are the deciding factor. Chronologically, Zamazenta was the latest Pokémon to get banned out of everyone we discussed, and if you look at the others in comparison to Zamazenta, you can see that a lot of these already banned Pokémon actually did pretty well against it. Gholdengo and Dragapult are immune to Zamazenta's main source of damage, and both Walking Wake and Deoxys Speed can outspeed it and hit it with special attacks to do loads of damage. However, all of these Pokémon were slowly banned from the tier, which also drastically shrunk the number of reliable answers to Zamazenta's main way of dealing damage through body press. Thus, this Pokémon, which had been a staple of the tier for over a year, slowly became more and more difficult to handle because all of its most prominent checks and counters slowly disappeared from the tier, which eventually led to Zamazenta itself getting banned. However, in standard overused, Zamazenta wasn't banned despite receiving a suspect test, because all of these other Pokémon were also not banned there. So, as you have been able to see, even the smallest differences between tiers can still lead to a vastly altered environment. And while usually it's the Pokémon influencing the metagame of the tier, every once in a while, the tier can also influence the metagame through alterations of the rules and the pool of available Pokémon, potentially causing series of cascading effects that can drastically change the state of play.